Okay, so I said today's a special day at Good Shepherd. It's First Communion Day. And so, because of that, we kind of veered off our normal reading, and we read the story from Luke, a resurrection story, but it's also a Eucharist story. A story that shows what our encounter with Christ in this meal at this table is all about. We learn from this story that our faith and the sacrament isn't much about stuff to believe, but a path to walk. And we realize to experience God's presence, we need to be present, to be aware, to be paying attention. When I was working in Manhattan, I was in my 20s, and I worked in Rockefeller Center in a big office building. And on my lunch hour, I would occasionally go shopping. There was a little shop in our building. I believe it was a Plymouth shop, but I can't remember exactly. And there were several people in there, and I don't know what I needed, a scarf or something, but I bought something, and I was online, there's a woman next to me, and she was nice and friendly and smiled and said hello. And we both kind of went up to the counter at the same time. There was two cashiers. And she paid for her stuff, and I paid for my stuff, and she was a little ahead of me, and she walked out the door. As soon as she walked out the door, everyone in the store was like, oh! Everybody's all excited, and I'm like, oh, it was Audrey Hepburn. Looking at her, smiling at her, said hello, standing next to her, paying for our stuff. Everybody else in the store knew it was Audrey Hepburn, not me. I guess I wasn't paying attention. I mean, Audrey Hepburn is very recognizable to anybody. Maybe not to children today, but certainly back in the early 70s, I think that she still was young enough that any of us would recognize her. But it was out of context. It was not an expensive store. It was kind of a cheap store. So I would think that it was Audrey Hepburn. So when we aren't paying attention, we can sometimes not recognize what's happening around us. And sitting here at Mass, we could be thinking of what we need to do and where we need to go when we get out of here. We can be worrying about the list of things we have to get done before we go back to work tomorrow. So when we're here, present to what's happening in the moment, we can open up our hearts and open ourselves up to recognizing Christ's presence. And if we practice that in all our moments, or as often as we can remind ourselves to pay attention again, we begin to see with different eyes and recognize the divine in everything and everyone. It's a tall order, though, isn't it? So let's put this story in context. Why Luke may have written this story to teach his community about Christ's presence. And my favorite Franciscan, Richard Rohr, explains that it might have gone something like this. Luke hears people in his community saying something like, okay, it's the year 80. Jesus has been gone for almost 50 years. We don't see him anymore. How is Jesus present to us? And Luke's response is, he is present in the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist, what we continue to do. We know him in the celebration. We can't sit down at the table like the first disciples did. I wasn't there myself, says Luke. But we can sit at this table in this place and experience the Lord's Supper just as they did, and know him just as they did in the breaking of the bread. And our hearts will burn within us. So our story takes place on Easter. We know this from, it's mentioned in the reading and the verses before. The two disciples are full of sorrow and grief, hopelessness. The person they thought would save their people and be their mighty leader is dead, crucified. They're full of fear and despair. So they decide to hit the road. They're walking with each other, trying to make sense of what happened, trying to comfort each other. And as they walk this road toward this town called Emmaus, a stranger comes up and asks them what they're talking about. And they tell him. He seems to know nothing of the events that have happened in the past few days. The stranger then speaks to them of the scriptures. He tries to explain that perhaps what happened had some sort of meaning. They're hurting and vulnerable, and so their hearts are open, and they're attentive to his words, and they listen to what this stranger has to say. Then when they arrive at their destination, the stranger says goodbye to continue on, but the disciples tell him it's late and it's getting dark. Why doesn't he stay the night, share a meal with them? So they go about preparing a meal, and they sit down at the table, and the stranger takes the bread, and he blesses it, and breaks it, and gives it to them. And in that moment, the disciples remember. They remember, they make it real again, and they know that Jesus is with them. He's not gone. They can feel his presence. The disciples in this moment remind us of our own struggle to recognize that the risen Christ always walks beside us. He's always present. And just like the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, we don't recognize him. And like those disciples, who then immediately traveled back to Jerusalem with renewed hope, joy of Christ's presence in their hearts, we can do the same. We can take that experience at this table with us out to the world, that joy, that hopefulness, and share it with everyone we meet. The last verse of today's gospel was, then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Everything in this story this morning can be summed up in that one last verse, where the two who walked with the risen Christ on the road to Emmaus tell of how they finally recognized him in the breaking of the bread. This is where Christ shows up for us again and again. In this feast and in this simple bread and wine, his presence persists and his blessing abides. It stays with us, and it's just waiting for us to recognize him.